There are not very many humans on this planet that I would come to Fargo in January for, but Joe is one of them. So I've enjoyed getting to know Joe and work with Joe, and you guys really do have a top-notch extension weed scientist here in the state of North Dakota. So, war against weeds in Kansas. I am Joe's counterpart in the state of Kansas. Responsibilities for extension programming across the state. Most of my research is in the northeast corner of the state, and I'll kind of explain what that means here in a minute. The things we're going to talk about today, I want to kind of let you guys understand my perspective because it is different than your all. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of driver weeds in Kansas, and that's going to help us transition into talking about metabolic herbicide resistance. That was probably the one thing that Joe said, I really think you should talk about metabolic resistance. And I think that's because it's all bad news and he wants you guys to like throw all the rotten tomatoes and rocks at me and not him later. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done trying to optimize herbicide applications. And then I'll follow up with a little bit different work on targeted herbicide applications. All right, so the great state of Kansas, right? It's basically a rectangle. And much like you guys, we have a big gradient in cropping systems across the state. So in the east, we have relatively small farms, relatively high rainfall, primarily corn, soybean rotations. I would say that our biggest weed management challenge in the eastern part of the state, the eastern third, is Palmer amaranth in soybeans. Okay, very Midwestern feel. In the middle part of the state, we have slightly larger farms, slightly less rainfall, and we grow a lot of grain sorghum in this area. In the southern part of the state, we actually grow a fair amount of cotton. There is cotton in Kansas. Some soybeans. Soybeans are kind of gradually moving west across the state, but we start to get into rotations that have a lot of winter wheat. In this part of the state, I would say that our number one weed management challenge is Palmer amaranth in grain sorghum. Okay, there are very, very limited herbicide options in grain sorghum, so a huge challenge there. And then as we go even further west, farm size increases. Okay, precipitation decreases, and we end up with kind of grass-based crop rotations. So it'd be like wheat fallow sorghum, wheat corn sorghum, wheat corn corn, corn corn corn, depending on if you have irrigation, depending on how much water is in the soil profile. Okay, those guys are pretty flexible with their summer cropping decisions. But our biggest weed management challenge out west, Palmer and maybe kochia, depending on where you are, but most folks would tell you kochia in wheat stubble. Okay, since we're in winter wheat, right, a lot of times we have fields that are essentially just wheat stubble from like July all the way through the following spring. So I put these I call them my herbicide resistance scorecards for our top weeds in Kansas. I put these together last year. They're ranked in order from the number of cases that are globally listed here at weedscience.org. And you can see, unfortunately, Kansas has been leading the charge on some of these herbicide resistance issues, especially in Palmer amaranth. Okay, give you guys a minute. And then in the eastern part of the state, we do still have water hemp. Okay, again, that eastern piece of the state is very, very much eastern corn belt feeling. And so you can see not quite as many cases of resistance listed there. But again, Kansas, in some cases, is leading the way in some of these resistance conformations. And then kochia would be probably our third most important weed. I mean, you can see Kansas is definitely, oh my goodness, this thing is weird. Kansas is definitely, you can see 1976 for atrazine resistance in kochia. Okay, so when we talk about herbicide resistance, we can group it into two kind of big buckets. The first bucket I'll call target site resistance. Okay, so target site resistance is what we were finding with all the ALS inhibiting herbicides, right? Those are kind of the poster kids for target site resistance. It's generally a single gene that's affected, generally just a couple of minor changes in that genetic code, okay? Develops pretty fast, it's there very quickly, okay? There's two different, so I mentioned there's two different things. One would be this change in the genetic code. Also, sometimes we see increased gene expression, and that would be considered a target site type of resistance. So we know that a lot of our glyphosate populations have this increased gene expression characteristic. The story gets really interesting when we start talking about non-target site resistance, okay? This is generally a little harder to nail down because it's typically multigenic or controlled by more than one gene. It will also kind of sneak up on you. The resistance develops slowly over time, okay? So it can be a little bit harder to detect, right? You guys have all had that experience where you see something every day and you don't notice the change, but then all of a sudden someone from out of town comes in and they're like, whoa, what happened? Okay. The other thing that is particularly concerning about non-target site resistance is that it has a greater chance of being associated with cross-resistance. So resistance to multiple herbicides with different sites of action. So one change causes resistance to multiple herbicides. There's a few types of non-target site resistance. One would be changes in the translocation or the movement of that herbicide. So for some reason, the herbicide is maybe not absorbed as well. It's translocated to the vacuoles or sequestered in the vacuoles. Okay, that would be one. The second one there, the Phoenix phenomenon, basically that's sort of like rapid death. The plant kind of isolates the herbicide, kills that part, and then the rest of the plant can regrow. But then the one we'll talk about in a little more detail is this idea of enhanced herbicide metabolism. So, metabolic herbicide resistance. I've been talking about this population with my folks in Kansas for a number of years now. So, my now former colleague, Mithila Jugulam, she's taken a position at Texas A&M now, but she had a student that worked with a Palmer amaranth population that many of you guys know my predecessor, Dallas Peterson. Dallas had a long-term no-till study at our primary research location in Northeast Kansas. And he found this Palmer amaranth population, and he noticed that 2,4-D was not controlling it. Okay, so that's what started down this path of investigation. So Mithila's student, Chandrima, got a hold of the seed, and they tested it for resistance to the 6 herbicides you see there, plus paraquat and Liberty. Okay, so we've got Glean, glyphosate, 2,4-D, cobra, atrazine, and meso. Glyphosate, not glyphosate. Paraquat and Liberty did control this population. Those 6 herbicides you see there did not. The resistance to glyphosate was associated with that increased copy number that we talked about. So just more target site. So kind of the target site won the war there. But the other 5 herbicides that this population was resistant to were associated with metabolic resistance. Okay. So basically, metabolic resistance just means that plant is going to process that herbicide too fast for the herbicide to effectively kill the plant. So herbicide metabolism is an important thing, right? We use it to have the selectivity between herbicides and crops, and it's a positive thing generally in those cases. It's driven primarily by a couple of types of enzymes. One is cytochrome P450s. Fun fact, you have enzymes that are considered cytochrome P450s in your body, and that's how we metabolize fun things like medications, alcohol, all those things, okay? The second step of herbicide metabolism is driven by a group of enzymes called GSTs, or glutathione transferases. This is actually the enzyme that lets us apply atrazine to corn. Okay, so we can use this as a good thing. I did some digging and I found a list there. From what I can tell, those modes of action groups listed all are affected by metabolic resistance. Group 1, Group 2, Group 5, glyphosate, some of the bleaching products, PPO inhibitors, and our Group 15 herbicides. So, metabolic resistance means that we have to change how we're thinking about herbicide resistance management. Okay? For one, I talked about the fact that non-target site resistance is more likely to be associated with cross resistance, right? So definitely, we're not going to spray our way out of metabolic resistance, okay? Number two, metabolic resistance reduces the effectiveness of mixing and rotating. So for a long time, we have put a lot of resources into talking about the importance of mixing and rotating herbicides, right? This is some modeling that was done pretty recently. And so on the y-axis, they're looking at target site resistance frequency. So how often do they have that genetic change on the target site for group 2s, and then 2 herbicide families within the group 1s. Okay. So sulfonylureas, products like Clozalafop or Shore, and then the cyclohexanedione, so products like Select. So you can see as they increased from 1 herbicide to 2, the frequency of resistance decreased, right? This is why we talk about mixing and rotating herbicides. When they were looking at the y-axis here is a concentration of a GST enzyme. So when they were looking at metabolic herbicide resistance, didn't matter how many they mixed. Didn't matter how many herbicides they had in their rotation. We were not able to have a significant difference in the rate of resistance. Okay. So what do we do if our number one best management practice for mitigating resistance is now kind of out the window? Well, I think it means a couple of things. I think it means we have to minimize the weed seed bank, which is not a new concept. I have counterparts that would tell you that we need to adopt a zero tolerance policy for seed production, especially for things like Palmer amaranth. Okay. And then the second piece of this is to adopt alternative management strategies. The challenge, and we'll talk about some of these here in a minute, and you guys heard Mike, I don't know where he went, you guys heard Mike talk about some of these earlier. The problem with these is that they tend to be costly, and they tend to be long-term solutions, or long-term, they require a long-term commitment before you start to see help or see improvements. So the first one would be just different types of harvest weed seed control. Okay, so that could include things like chaff lining. Windrow burning typically is a non-starter in most places in Kansas for a lot of the obvious reasons. And then the impact mills, which you heard Mike talk about earlier. These are some figures that I stole from Michael Walsh, who is a weed scientist from Australia and was really instrumental in getting this idea of harvest weed seed control kind of off the ground. So the key takeaway from these two figures, so they're looking at, on the top, ryegrass plants per meter squared, and then on the bottom, ryegrass seed production per meter squared, is that harvest weed seed control can complement herbicides. Okay, so all the weed scientists that are looking at this, I don't think any would say that it's going to replace herbicides. It can complement herbicides, and it takes multiple years to have that effect. I know Kevin Bradley at the University of Missouri did some studies looking at harvest weed seed control for water hemp, and in 1 year, it didn't show a lot of difference. The weed seed bank in those fields was so big that 1 or 2 years wasn't going to be enough to make a difference. From where I see things, some of the biggest kind of cautions or things to think about when you're thinking about adopting harvest weed seed control is, where are we losing the weed seeds? We know that seeds that go through those mills are like 90+% likely to be controlled, but how much is actually going through the mills? So we chased a combine around a field and contributed to this data set with Palmer amaranth seed from Kansas. I was actually the person in the grain tank. I don't recommend it if you can avoid it. So we figure we were losing 20 to 40% at the header, okay? And then about 50 to 80% of it was going through the mill, okay? So 90% control of 80% of the seeds would kind of be the maximum there. Something else that we've played with a little bit in Kansas is this idea of inter-row mowing. I would tell you this is not a plan A for weed control, but I think it is a good plan B, or in some cases, a very feasible plan B for kind of rescue situations. If you just want to be able to stop seed production later in the season, or be able to harvest something that might otherwise be unharvestable. So pictured is a machine that was designed by a Kansas farmer. He calls it the row shaver. Basically, it's a lawnmower on a toolbar. But also there's a Kansas company called Greenfield Robotics. And they are trying to automate this process on autonomous little robots, so kind of like Roombas for your soybean field, that would mow the weeds. Clearly, when you mow weeds in June, they're going to regrow. So again, not a plan A, but maybe a salvage type of operation. Another project that we got involved in was this idea of weed electrocution, okay? So this, again, was a project led by Kevin Bradley out of the University of Missouri. When we were electrocuting Palmer amaranth, we had about 50% control, about a 30% reduction in viable seed production. Again, not a plan A option, maybe a plan B option. Clearly not a replacement for herbicides. Okay, do you guys have questions or comments at this point before we switch gears? Okay, so optimizing herbicide applications. So this slide is a little bit kind of out of sync with some of the rest of the stuff, so I thought I would just start with this data set. So for 4 years now, I've had various graduate students working on soybean commission funded projects, trying to optimize the relationship between row spacing and the use of layered residual herbicides in soybeans, right? Joe, this is a little heretical. You might want to take the mic from me after I say this, okay? We do what? So, to be honest, I was hesitant to share this data much, but Rodrigo in North Central, I think you heard him say that his data basically says the same thing. All those 8 site years, so we go from very northeast Kansas to almost Oklahoma, okay, so a pretty good north-south representation there in the soybean producing region of the state. There's not a single site year in that data set where we can statistically separate weed control between treatments that have a layered residual and treatments that don't have a layered residual. Okay. Now, when I talk about this with my Kansas farmers, I talk about the fact that I am risk avoidant in my personality. And even though we couldn't statistically separate those, you guys can see the spread, the difference in the spread of the data between the top and the bottom there, okay? We greatly increase our chances of having reasonably successful weed control, and we include that layered residual herbicide. Now, the data point that I don't have here, and that I'm kicking myself for not having, is seed production, right? See the previous comments about zero tolerance for seed production. You know, they're especially with a plant like Palmer amaranth, that produces 1 billion seeds per female plant, there could be a big difference in seed production between 95% control or 90% control and 97% control. One of the other ways we've looked at optimizing residual herbicides is just trying to get kind of Kansas-specific recommendations for how do these different products behave in different environments. Okay, I had a PhD student who, over a couple of different summers, we put out the products listed here. So we had a non-encapsulated acetochlor, we had Outlook, Zidua, Dual, and then our non-treated. Okay, we put these out at 5 different dates. So starting in like really early April, all the way through early June. So just trying to hit different environments there. This result is largely going to be associated with the water solubility of these herbicides. But the things I want to point out here, so in this case, we're looking at polymer amaranth height. So there's our non-treated in the yellow on top. And then the purple line that is next would be the acetochlor. And then the two that are hardest to separate are Outlook and Dual. And then the Zidua is that last line at the bottom. So the shortest polymer. So then we took that information and created these graphs where we measured heat or temperature by soil growing degree days. So we measured the soil temperature and used the growing degree day calculation because we figured that's what was going to drive weed emergence. And then the x-axis there is just rainfall. So the 4-week after treatment data, there's not a ton of differences there. So the top box on both sides of this chart is the acetochlor. And then the second one is the Outlook, followed by Zidua and Dual. Okay, so it didn't matter what conditions we put the Zidua or the Dual out under, they performed above 95% weed control. Okay, acetochlor kind of fell apart first as we went up the rainfall scale there, which is not surprising given what we know about water solubility. And then the interesting thing about Outlook to me was the decrease in weed control right there in that kind of low rainfall, high temperature region. 8 weeks out, the story was a little different. Zidua, I think the takeaway here is that Zidua treatments performed the best over the widest range of environments. Okay. And then this is a data set. We were part of a multi-state study with USB looking at kind of a similar concept for soybean herbicides, except it wasn't just single active ingredient products. So you can see there was Authority Supreme, Boundary, Broadax, Dual, Fierce MTZ, Prefix, Spartan, Tricor, Tricor plus Zidua, Valor, and then Zidua. And so the application timing here, they either applied these products at planting or 14 days before planting, and then they measured weed control 21 days after planting. So I highlighted a couple of boxes here, but there is a good bit of interest in kind of fine-tuning metribuzin rates, right? Metribuzin is a photosystem 2 inhibiting herbicide, much like atrazine, but it will still control atrazine-resistant weeds, okay? The data that I'm going to show you came from very many site years. You can see them on the map there. I'm a grad student that I kind of helped out of Mithila's group analyze these data. So we're in the process of getting them published now. The basic kind of structure of these treatments is that we had 4 to 16 ounces of a Tricor or similar type of product that did vary from location to location, but the amount of metribuzin was the same. And we had a Spartan check, and then a Dual 2 Magnum check, and then a non-treated and a weed-free. So when we look at all of the weed control data and all of the crop injury data across all of those locations, 14 days after treatment, we had excellent weed control with pretty much any metribuzin rate above that 7 ounces of trichlor. Okay. As we move out to 42 days after treatment, we needed something more like 8 or 9 ounces of trichlor, maybe 10, in order to achieve the highest level of weed control. The interesting thing here is that soybean injury was 5% or less with all of those rates. And so, you know, the kind of takeaway from this slide would be that we can probably recommend higher rates of metribuzin than what we're currently recommending, because we're not getting the soybean injury that maybe a few decades ago, 20 years ago, we would have expected. The other way that Rashab looked at these data was to figure out how much metribuzin would it take to achieve 100% weed control up to 42 days after treatment. Okay, so if you look, he used a statistical technique called principal components analysis, which basically says how important are different factors for predicting what variables are driving the data. So the two that he felt were most important from that analysis were clay or organic matter content, which makes sense based off of the label, and then precipitation, which makes sense based off of what we know about activation of residual herbicides. So low clay, ideal precipitation, the rate needed for excellent control 42 days after was actually higher than what we tested. So we felt like we predicted that we could get 90% control with 3/4 of a pound of metribuzin. Fairly similar for the low clay late precipitation at 0.8, which was actually a little higher than what we tested. The medium clay, but good precipitation, it was, again, about 3/4 of a pound. And then high clay, ideal precipitation, we could get excellent weed control with 2/3 of a pound. Okay. Rashab is still kind of trying to figure out the very best way to present some of these data. So he tried a different statistical method. I think we need to refine the variables that we're using there on the y-axis, but some things to point out here, things that were important for determining how good a weed control we were going to have: soil temperature at the time of application, right? That's going to affect soybean growth. That's going to affect herbicide degradation. The amount of precipitation that was accumulated in the time period of the study, and then the amount of the first precipitation. Okay, so those are some of the key things. And those ideas carry over to another paper that I was able to be part of. This project was led by a postdoc in the USDA system. His name is Chris Lando. He is a great data scientist. He has taken the herbicide evaluation data from pretty much every state in the North Central region and started mining that data set to look for trends and answers that we maybe can't extract from single-year studies. Okay, so the very tiny print in these figures is telling us what is important for predicting water hemp, morning glory, and giant foxtail weed control sometime between 7 and 21 days after application of glufosinate. Okay, so from left to right, we've got the water hemp graph, total rainfall and temperature 5 days after application were important, and then the average temperature 5 days before application was also important. Okay, for the morning glory species, it was solar radiation, and then that temperature 5 days before. And then for foxtail, it was solar radiation on the day of application, the temperature 5 days after application, and then average humidity on the day of application. Okay, so probably some things in there that are not terribly surprising, but it's interesting to me the difference among the species. The other way that Chris looked at this data is to create these graphs that show the change in predicting the weed control. So the columns, you've got water hemp, morning glory, foxtail, and then on the rows, he's comparing We're looking at the combination of air temperature 5 days before application, rainfall 5 days before application. So that combination looks pretty forgiving to me. There's a lot of dark blue in there, which suggests that it was good weed control in most of those scenarios. He's got solar radiation, so photosynthetic activity, the day of application, and then relative humidity. And so, not a lot of surprises here. The pigweeds, you can see there's more of that dark blue as relative humidity increases. And then looking at air temperature 5 days after application compared to rainfall 5 days after application. That was pretty important too as we think about focusing on the water hemp there. All of the dark blue when we had the greatest rainfall and the highest temperatures. Okay. So these are some data that my student Lalit worked on collecting this summer. I would consider these preliminary data. This is 1 year, one location. He gets to come back in 2025 and repeat this. And he did a great job with it last year. I'm sure he'll do a great job with it this year. But we are borrowing, well, let me take a step back. At least once, if I had $1 for every time, I could probably go on vacation to a pretty nice place. But at least once a summer, I get asked, how hot and humid is hot and humid enough for Liberty to work? And when is it too hot that I'm wasting my time running my sprayer and we should just shut down and try again later, right? So we started out just looking at temperature and humidity calculations, and then I was reminded, I think some of you guys up here probably use delta T for talking about herbicide applications. So delta T is not something that my applicators in Kansas have been using. So basically, it's a function of temperature and humidity. The ideal range is between 2 and 8. And when we looked at our Palmer Amaranth control with Liberty or with Liberty Plus Enlist, with the exception of this oddball right here, that we probably need to go back and double check and make sure that that's not an outlier. All of our Palmer Amaranth control ratings that were less than 80% occurred when delta T was outside of that 2 to 8 range. Okay, so some of you guys, like I said, I know have been using this up here, but this was new news for my Kansas applicators. So we're moving towards helping them answer that question of how hot and humid is hot and humid enough. The other thing that's interesting about that data set, and this lines up with some of the things that I saw Mike presenting earlier, is that when we added the Enlist, the effect of temperature and humidity was greatly decreased, right? We had better control in general. Again, with the exception of the oddball data point down here. Better control with Liberty Plus Enlist compared to, or more consistent control with Liberty Plus Enlist compared to Liberty alone. The other field project that Lalit has been working on is trying to fine-tune the recommendations for 2-pass kind of rescue scenarios for big pigweeds and soybeans. So we grow a fair amount of double crop soybeans in Kansas. So harvest the winter wheat in early July, late June, and plant a soybean crop. And a lot of times what we're planting that soybean crop into are pigweeds that were harvested by the combine, right? So they were a foot tall when they cut the wheat, and now they're regrowing in the soybeans. And double crop soybeans are kind of a bonus crop, right? We try to go low input. They a lot of times don't get the herbicide programs that they need. And guys are chasing the combine. There's a lot of logistics going on there. So dig into the literature. There are some other studies with similar treatment lists, and that's how we developed the spray intervals here of 3, 10, or 14 days after or between the applications. But they were good kids. They were all spraying 4-inch pigweeds. We were spraying 12-inch pigweeds. The takeaway here from this data set is that it didn't matter what combination we used, if we sprayed Liberty alone or Liberty Plus Enlist first or second. It didn't matter how many days were between the two applications, but what mattered was that we had two applications. So again, this is a project that we're going to repeat in 2025 at a couple locations and hopefully have a more robust data set. Okay, I've got about 15 minutes here to talk about this last idea. This has been a fun project for me to work on. So I'm going to guess that most folks in this room are familiar with the concept of targeted spraying. You've heard about See and Spray, some of the other targeted spraying systems. So baselining here, technically targeted spraying is not spot spraying, and it's also not a prescription application, right? So in this case, we're talking about machines that have cameras. They can sense the weeds as they're going across the field and then spray only those emerged weeds. You guys can tell me after my presentation if you think how complete you think this list is. I've added to it a couple of times since my initial iteration of this, but in the state of Kansas, Deere and Weed It have the biggest market share for targeted spraying. Okay, I know there are some folks that have weed seekers. I've heard there's some folks that have ordered green eye systems. I've talked to some sales rep for the precision planting systems, but no actual farmers. And then I haven't heard anything about the other two companies in Kansas. So the genesis of this study was one of my partners in crime in Kansas. His name is Lucas Haig. He is a recovering ag engineer who is one of our area agronomists. He works out of Colby in that northwest corner of the state. Okay, so lots of fallow acres in his part of the world, and I think that's important to remember here. So Lucas called me one day in the summer of 2023, and he was like, Sarah, we are missing an opportunity to understand how these See and Spray machines are being used and how that use pattern is going to change over time. Right, so I said he's a recovering ag engineer, so his frame of reference was yield monitors. Okay, I was in college. I'll tell my age here. You're never supposed to ask a lady her age, but I'll tell you my age. I was in college when yield monitors were, coming to market, and we had all these grand hopes and plans, and I'm not sure we're always using them the way we thought we would when they first came out. And so that was Lucas's frame of references. We think we're going to do this now, but what are we actually going to do later? So we started finding the folks that we considered the early adopters of this technology in Kansas. So these were folks that had See and Spray machines in 2023, 2024. Okay. We also talked to some folks that had green eye machines. What we did is we talked to about 10 farmers. Actually 11 farmers, sorry. And we just went and sat down and had conversations with them, right? We developed a list of questions and just went and chatted with them to figure out what their experience was. So a couple of things to think about on this slide. I've got in the boxes in the text the type of machines that were represented in the different regions, okay? So the Weed Its, mostly in the western part of the state, those machines are aftermarket, and they are only green on brown. So they can only detect the weeds in like a wheat stubble situation, okay? The economic incentive to do that is pretty big, okay? In fact, one of the farmers I talked to said that Weed It system allowed them to convert from conventional tillage in their fallow to no-till in their fallow. So it was a definite game changer for their operation. The See and Spray Select is green on brown. The See and Spray Premium is green on green, but it's one tank, one boom, so it has some limitations. And then the Ultimate is the one that is 2 tanks, 2 booms, green on green, or green on brown. So the other thing I want you to take away from this figure, or this map, you guys tell me, where are all of my little sprayer icons located? bigger operations in areas where wheat is an important part of the rotation. Okay, so this is just my hunch after talking to these guys and seeing where this stuff took off. Those are the two driving characteristics there is the economic returns in fallow and wheat stubble, and then like a lot of new tech, having the acres to spread that cost out over. Okay, so these are the guys we talked to. They ranged in age from 26 to 51 years old. Not all of them were the key decision maker on their farms, but they were lucky enough to have a older generation that had the checkbook who is willing to take some risks and try new things. Okay. Farm size really was all over the board, all the way from 7,000 acres up to 350,000 acres. So our average farm size was about 70,000 acres. Most of them said they were going to spray less than half of their acres using the targeted spraying feature. Okay, so we asked that question two different ways. The first way we asked it was, how many acres do you spray total? And then how many do you think you're going to use the targeted spraying on? And so they said about 44% of their total acres would be targeted spraying. So we can talk a lot about, what are the characteristics associated with acres that are appropriate for targeted spraying? And a lot of it, I think, has to do with residuals, right? A lot of these, we're going to still blanket residual applications. And then also, what is your overall weed pressure? Like a lot of technologies, targeted spraying isn't going to take a bad weed manager and magically make them good, but it will take someone who's done a good job preventing weed emergence and get them to that closer to that zero tolerance threshold for weed seed production. So this is tied back into the farm side, that fourth bullet there. 7 out of 11 of the people that we talked to had at least one other machine. Okay, so they were able to kind of dedicate their targeted spraying machine to the acres where it was needed. So one of the major concerns about the logistics of these systems is, how do we tender these systems, right? So the secret sauce here is some sort of fast loading system. A lot of these guys did not have this previously. Well, actually, most of them had one previously. 2 of them did decide to purchase one of these loading systems when they purchased the Ultimate. Okay, so we asked these guys, what are the greatest benefits? Probably no surprises here. For the Ultimate folks, it was economics. Okay, time was not mentioned, it was all economics. For the premium guys, the premium systems have been put in the marketplace at a price point that is hard to argue with. And so these guys were a little different than the other folks. So one of them talked about environmental impact, but the thing I liked as a weed scientist is that if we have the opportunity to spray with a lower cost, because we know we're spraying less chemical, we're probably more apt to go out and spray things sooner, knowing that we can spray weeds when they're the right size and then come back later and get that next flush without having to blanket the whole field. If there's one thing from a weed management perspective that's a benefit of this tech, I think that is definitely it. The green on brown guys, to a person, it was time management, right? A lot of these guys, again, are spraying wheat stubble. They like the fact that they can load the sprayer in the morning and go spray all day, okay, and not have to come back and reload. The greatest limitations of these systems, all over the board, still a lot of room for improvement here. There are some concerns about coverage in the system, and I know there's a little bit of research looking at like nozzles and things of that nature to kind of address some of that. Speed, especially if you're a custom applicator trying to cover acres. Speed is definitely a limitation here with some of these systems. Another thing is that the See & Spray Ultimate and See & Spray Premium, they are what we call passive sensors. So they have to have sunlight to work. Things like the Weed It, that's an active sensor. It has its own light source. So the ultimate guys are limited as to the hours when they can spray. Also have lots of issues with dust and shading, especially in the cameras that are right behind the wheels. Cost, the initial cost of the machine, also the subscription fee, the boom height requirements is also a concern, especially we have a lot of terraced fields in Kansas. And so they have a lot of times. I had a farmer actually share a map with me, his as-applied map, and you could see where the terraces were in the field because the machine went into fallback mode. Like you could map the terraces based on when the machine went into fallback mode. And then the green on brown guys, they know they're going to have to make more passes. Okay. So it's a trade-off for that within the spray pass time savings with overall knowing you're going to have to cover the ground again. Other things to think about, tendering is more complicated. The younger farmers that I talked to acted like it's not a big deal. We could pull up to the field and estimate, how much are we going to need and just kind of go from there. The other thing about that is, what do we do with what's left in the tank at the end of the day? Most of these guys are just gauging how many acres they have left in their tank and turning it on to broadcast at the appropriate time. Okay. The middle bullet there, what portion of your acres are actually suited for this type of application? Depending on your operating costs, the cost of your herbicide program, that number is going to be different for everybody, right? Because there's going to be a kind of a break-even point there where the herbicide savings don't justify the other expenses. And then, there are still a lot of regulatory questions. One of the first questions that I got from farmers is, since I'm only going to spray 50% of the field, can I put a 2x rate on that 50% of the field? Short answer there is no. But I think there's some other, probably legal questions around that. Kirk talked about separating out herbicides based on antagonism issues, and I think he hit the nail on the head. That data kind of varies from environment to environment, and it can help, but it's not perfect. And then Joe and I will talk about later the Endangered Species Act mitigation points. You can get credit for reducing the acres that you actually, or the percentage of your field that you actually spray. So just wanted to share a little bit of my experiences. I don't know how much contact you guys have had for this. I guess one thing I should have said at the outset, Kansas, we have like 4 or 5% of the nation's acres in corn, soybeans, and cotton. We have 16% of Deere's See and Spray machines for Ultimates and like 60% of the See and Spray machines for Select. So we have a disproportionate number of machines in Kansas, which is part of why I thought this was a good project to do. So this was 2 years ago. This was 2022 that we did this. And this was just a strip trial. We were hoping to go back in and kind of figure out Joe Liberty application timings and spot spraying with Liberty. So you can see on the left, that is where we, the strips without the yellow, that's where we didn't spray with the See and Spray. And then the one on the right, that's actually our yield map. The other thing, and this is my kind of wild hair, and we've done this once for kind of a proof of concept, but looking at applying a higher rate of residual herbicides where we know we have a potential for a weed seed bank based on previous year's weed maps. So can we, again, move closer to that zero tolerance threshold by increasing our residual herbicide rates? Don't love the data that we were able to generate here. We had some yield monitor issues, but it looks like, we should be able, at least from an agronomic side, be able to do this. So, takeaways here. Metabolic resistance means zero tolerance for weed seed production, non-chemical weed control, There's a lot of things that we can control to try to improve our herbicide applications, but I think it's also important to consider the environment and try to time things for the best environment possible. And then if you've got folks or you yourself are considering some sort of targeted spraying system, consider what your weed densities are in these fields just year to year, and know that not all of your acres are going to be suited for these types of machines. And so keep that in mind in your economics as you're making that decision. In case you're not tired of hearing about the podcast, these are the episodes that have to do with the topics that we talked about today. And if you guys have any questions or comments after today, here is how to find me, email and socials and things of that nature. So thank you guys for your time. I am officially 3 minutes into your lunch.
I'm curious about See and Spray, given how kochia grows in mats. What have you seen for effectiveness?
So the question is, tell us about See and Spray for kochia where you have that big mat. I have mostly looked at it myself on Palmer. My sense, though, is that it would spray the patches just like one weed. Does that make sense? Because I think that's what it would do. Soybean injury at different pH levels. That's a question that I've gotten. I have tried to look at soybean injury at high pHs. When you want to get soybean injury at a high pH, it's a challenge.
I'll have a little bit of data on thermite.
And Joe's going to talk about that too.
Yeah, so the question from Mike on Zoom regards to your term delta T. That was in Celsius. So we do have a publication that does show that in Fahrenheit. The curves on the graph that Sarah showed are the exact same curves, but ours is in Fahrenheit. So if you Google NDSU delta T, Andrew Thorstensen has a really nice publication discussing it. And I believe there's a graph in the weed guide this year as well. So that should help clarify that, put it into Fahrenheit.